Picture a summer evening in 1974. The screen door bangs shut behind you. Your mother doesn't look up from the sink. She just calls out, "Be home when the streetlights come on." And that's it. That's the whole conversation. No cell phone, no helmet, no car seat waiting in the driveway. You climb into the front seat of your dad's Buick, no belt across your lap, and the whole wide world is yours until dark. You lived that. So did your brothers and sisters. So did every kid on your block. And here's the strange part. Nearly every single thing you did back then, the things nobody thought twice about, would today get a parent fined, sued, or splashed across the evening news. Tonight we're counting down 25 of them. Number 4 was something you did every single day without a second thought. And today it's the fastest way to get pulled over. Number 9? A child could walk up to a counter, hand over a few coins, and walk out with it. Alone. And number 1, the one we'll end on, is the image that says it all. The freest, most dangerous, most beautiful thing about being a kid back then. None of it disappeared all at once. Nobody woke up one morning and outlawed your childhood. It was a law here, a study there, a warning label, a new rule, a lawsuit, quietly closing the doors of a looser, wilder world, one at a time, until the way we all grew up simply wasn't allowed anymore. And here's the honest truth. It wasn't all perfect. We learned some things for good reasons, but somewhere in all that safety, we lost something too. A kind of freedom you can still feel in your chest when you close your eyes and hear that screen door bang shut. If you remember a childhood like that, if you were one of the ones who made it home when the streetlights came on, do me a favor and subscribe before we begin. This whole channel is for the ones who remember. Now let's count them down, from 25 all the way to 1. Number 25. The neighborhood after supper. The dishes were still soaking in the sink, but you were already gone. Out the door, down the steps, swallowed up by a neighborhood full of kids who'd done the exact same thing. No grown-up came with you. No one carried a phone, because there was no such thing. You roamed. You crossed yards that weren't yours. You walked to the creek, to the empty lot, to the house 3 streets over, and not a single adult knew exactly where you were at any given minute, and nobody panicked about it. Here's something most folks have forgotten. That wasn't neglect. That was the whole design of American childhood. A mother could send 4 kids out the door at 9 in the morning and not see them again until the streetlights flickered on, and that was considered good parenting. The street raised you as much as the house did. You learned things out there you could never learn inside. How to settle a fight without a referee. How to find your way home when you'd wandered too far. How to be bored and then invent something out of nothing. A game, a fort, a whole afternoon spun out of a stick and a ditch. And then, slowly, the streets emptied. The news started running stories that made every parent's blood run cold. Schedules filled up. Backyards got fences. Somewhere along the way, "Be home by dark" turned into "Stay where I can see you," and a child walking alone became something a neighbor might call the police about. The freedom didn't get taken in one law, it just quietly went out of style, and the streets have been a little too quiet ever since. We let go of something out there in the dusk. We're still not sure we got anything better in return. Number 24. Keeping a wild animal in the den like it was a house cat. Walk into the right rec room in 1972 and you might find a monkey on the curtain rod, an ocelot on a leash, a baby alligator in a tank by the TV, growing a little bigger every month. People kept lion cubs, boa constrictors, raccoons they'd raised from kits. You'd see them at parties, riding on shoulders, and the only question anyone asked was, "Can I hold him?" For a stretch of years there, exotic pets were a genuine craze, and you could get one through a magazine ad or a roadside stand without a single piece of paperwork. No permit, no questions. If you had the cash and the nerve, you could bring home something with claws. It felt thrilling. It felt like the frontier had never really closed. Like a regular family on a regular street could own a piece of the jungle. And then those cubs grew up. The gators got too big for the tank. Folks learned the hard way that a wild thing stays wild, and the laws came down county by county until that monkey on the curtain rod became a thing you'd only ever see again in an old photograph. The wild used to be something you could bring inside. We decided, eventually, that it was better left where it belonged. Number 23. Milk straight from the cow, sold right off the farm. You drove out past the edge of town, where the pavement turned to gravel, and you brought your own jug. The farmer filled it from the morning's milking. Still faintly warm, the cream already rising thick to the top. You'd shake it, or you wouldn't, because some folks liked that first rich pour. It tasted like the field smelled. Nothing in a carton has ever come close. That raw milk was a normal part of the week for families all over rural America. You knew the farmer. You knew the cows, sometimes by name. There was a trust in it, a short, simple line between the animal and your kitchen table, with nobody in between. Over the years, that line got drawn shut. The science on what raw milk could carry got harder to argue with, and selling it across the counter became restricted or outright banned in much of the country. There were good reasons, but something honest disappeared with it. That warm jug, that gravel road, that handshake trust between a family and the farm that fed them. Your grandmother poured it without a worry in the world. Now you'd need to know somebody. Number 22. A house painted in lead, and nobody the wiser. The color was richer back then. You'll swear it was, and you're not wrong. Those old paints covered like a dream and held their shine for years. They were also full of lead, and so was the paint on the crib rail, the windowsill, the baseboard a toddler might gnaw on while he learned to stand. Nobody knew. The can didn't warn you because the warning hadn't been written yet. For decades, lead was simply what made paint good. Durable, bright, worth the money. It was in homes, schools, on toys. An entire country grew up running its hands along walls coated in the stuff and never gave it a thought. Then the studies came, quietly at first, then impossible to ignore, and lead paint was pulled from the shelves and written out of the law. It was the right call. But it's a strange thing, isn't it, to learn years later that the very walls you grew up inside held something nobody had warned your mother about. We didn't know. That's the whole truth of it. We just didn't know yet. Number 21. Lead in the gas tank, and a cloud of it on every street. You remember the smell at the filling station? That sweet, heavy gasoline smell that hung in the air while the attendant in his uniform topped you off and checked your oil? You probably leaned your head out the window to breathe it in. Half the country did. That fuel was leaded, and so was the exhaust drifting down every busy road, every school zone curb, every downtown corner where kids waited for the bus. Lead made engines run smoother, and for a long time that was reason enough. It went into the gasoline without a second thought, and the fumes went everywhere a car could go, which, by the 1970s, was everywhere. A whole generation grew up breathing the air on those streets. It took years of careful work to understand what all that lead was doing, and years more to phase it out of the pump. The cleaner air came slowly, almost invisibly, the way these changes always did. Most folks never noticed the day it happened. They just remember that smell, and how nobody, not once, told them to step back from it. We breathed it in like it was nothing, because as far as anyone told us, it was. Number 20. Flame retardants soaked into the pajamas you tucked your kids into. There was a stretch of years when the safest sounding thing on the rack was children's sleepwear treated to resist fire. A mother would read that label and feel a little better tucking her little ones in at night. The fabric was stiff in a particular way, treated with chemistry that promised to keep a sleeping child safe from a stray spark or a space heater. It came from a good place, a real fear, a real push to keep kids from harm. And for a while it was everywhere, sewn into pajamas and built into the foam of the couch you all piled onto for Sunday television. Then the questions started about the chemicals themselves, what they were, what they did, whether the cure had its own cost. Some of those old treatments got pulled and rewritten out of the rules. It's the quiet pattern of that whole era, a fix for one danger that turned out to carry another, discovered only years down the road. We were trying to keep them safe. We always were. We just didn't have the whole picture yet. Number 19. The artificial sweetener that vanished from the shelf. It was in the diet sodas, the sugar-free gum, the little packets on the diner table. Cyclamate. You might not remember the name, but you remember the taste, the promise of sweetness without the guilt. Right there in the bottle your aunt drank by the case. For a good while, it was simply part of the American pantry. It rode in on a wave of modern living, the space-age idea that science had finally figured out how to give you everything you wanted and none of what you didn't. You drank it, your mother drank it, and nobody thought twice. And then it was pulled, more or less overnight, when the safety questions caught up with it. One day it was on every shelf. Not long after, it was gone, written out of the marketplace. If you ever wondered why a soda you loved as a kid just disappeared and never came back, sometimes this was why. It was the taste of the future, until the future changed its mind. Number 18. A red dye in everything sweet, until the day it wasn't. It colored the candy, the maraschino cherries, the bottle of pop, the frosting on the birthday cake. Red dye number 2 made the good things look the way good things were supposed to look. Bright, bold, impossible for a kid to walk past. It was in so much of what you reached for that you'd never have thought to ask what was in it. That was the deal back then. Food was supposed to look cheerful, and a whole rainbow of additives made sure it did. Nobody read the ingredients. Nobody knew the names. You just knew the cherry on top was the reddest red you'd ever seen. When the worries about that particular dye reached a boiling point, it got pulled, and a small, strange piece of the way your childhood looked went with it. The reds got a little different after that. You might not be able to say how, but somewhere in your memory, the cherries were brighter once. The colors of childhood used to come out of a can. We didn't know to ask what was inside. Number 17. Wild pets, lawn chemicals, and a medicine cabinet that wasn't childproof. Think about the bathroom cabinet in any house you knew. The aspirin bottle had a cap that twisted off easy. No pushing, no lining up the arrows, no fighting it. Anyone could open it, which meant a curious 3-year-old could too. The cleaning products under the sink came in bottles a kid could pop in a second. Half the dangerous things in the house were a simple twist away. That was just how a home was built. Convenience came first, because the alternative hadn't been invented yet. Grandma could get her pills open with arthritic hands in a heartbeat, and the trade-off, that a toddler could do the same, wasn't something anyone had sat down and reckoned with. It took a wave of hard lessons and new rules to give us the child-proof cap, the safety latch, the locked cabinet. They saved lives, no question. But they're also a little monument, sitting right there on your bathroom shelf, to a time when nobody thought they were necessary at all. The house used to trust you to know better. Then it stopped trusting, for good reason, and a little of the ease went out of everyday life. Pattern break 1. Let's stop the count for just a minute, because by now you might be feeling something, and I want to name it honestly. It would be easy to look back at all this and think we were careless, foolish even, breathing the fumes, drinking the raw milk, painting the nursery in lead. But that's not the truth of it, and I don't want you to walk away believing it is. Nobody was being reckless on purpose. Your mother wasn't gambling with your life when she put you in the front seat. Your father wasn't cutting corners when he filled the tank and breathed deep. They did exactly what good, loving parents did with what was known at the time. The science simply hadn't been done yet. The studies hadn't come back. The law that would one day forbid it hadn't been written because the world hadn't learned the thing it would take to write it. That's the quiet engine behind this whole list. It wasn't a villain in a back room deciding to end your childhood. It was a slow, patient accumulation of knowledge. A study here, a tragedy there, a rule passed in a state house you'd never visit. Each one closed a door that had always stood open, and no single one of them felt like much at the time. So when you feel that pull of nostalgia, and I hope you do, know that it's not a longing to be careless again. It's a longing for a world that hadn't yet learned to be afraid. There's a difference, and we'll feel it more with every number we have left. Now, back to the count. Number 16, a haze of cigarette smoke over the department store, the hospital, the classroom. Step through the doors of any big store downtown, and the air met you first, that blue-gray drift of cigarette smoke hanging under the fluorescent lights, mixing with the smell of new fabric and floor wax. The lady at the perfume counter had an ashtray right there beside the register. So did the bank teller. So did the nurse at the front desk of the hospital. And sometimes, you remember this, the teacher in the lounge just down the hall from your classroom. Smoking wasn't a thing you stepped outside to do. It was simply part of the indoor air. Everywhere people gathered. Offices, waiting rooms, the break room at the factory. A pack sat on the table the way a coffee cup did. Nobody asked if it bothered you, because the question hadn't been invented yet. It changed so gradually, you almost can't point to the day. First a section, then a ban, then a quiet understanding that the air belonged to everyone in the room. The ashtrays disappeared from the counters one by one. And a younger person today simply cannot picture it, lighting up in a hospital, in a store, a few feet from a stranger's child, though for you it was just Tuesday. The whole world used to smell faintly of smoke. We stopped noticing until one day it was gone. Number 15. Driving home on a looser line than the law allows now. The dinner was long, the drinks were poured freely, and then everyone got in their cars and drove home. Nobody thought of it as dangerous. There was no ride waiting, no one assigned to stay sober, no second thought at all. You drove the way your father drove and his friends drove, home through the dark, windows down, the radio low, after an evening that today would keep a man parked until morning. The line for what counted as too much used to sit in a very different place, and the whole culture sat comfortably on the wrong side of it. A couple of drinks before the road was ordinary, expected even. The danger was real, we know that now, painfully well, but back then it lived in everyone's blind spot at once. What changed wasn't just the law, it was a hard, grieving shift in how a whole country saw the thing, driven by families who'd lost someone and refused to let it stay quiet. The rules got stricter, the line moved, and one of the most ordinary acts of a 1970s evening became one we'd never wave off so easily again. This is one where we'll all admit it. We know why this one changed. Some doors needed closing. Number 14. Turning 18 and ordering a legal drink. For a stretch of years in a lot of the country, 18 was the number. You came back from your first job, or your first year away, and you could walk into a bar and order a beer with your own name on the tab. Legal, grown, no fake anything required. 18 meant you were a man. It meant the door to the adult world swung all the way open at once. There was a logic to it that felt obvious at the time. If a young man was old enough to be handed a uniform and sent overseas, the thinking went, he was old enough to be handed a beer at home. That argument carried real weight in those years, for reasons every family of that era understood in their bones. Then the number moved, state by state, up to 21. Pushed along by the same hard reckoning over the roads. A whole slice of young adulthood that your generation simply had got rewritten for the ones who came after. If you remember being 18 and legal, you remember a version of growing up that doesn't exist anymore. You came of age the moment they handed you that glass. They moved the moment 3 years down the road. Number 13. Cigarette ads playing right between your favorite shows. The jingle was as familiar as the theme song. There on the television, in the living room, between the Western and the Variety Hour, came the cigarette commercials. The rugged man on horseback, the elegant couple, the cartoon mascot a child could sing right back to you by heart. Tobacco was woven straight into the fabric of the entertainment you gathered around every single night. It sponsored the shows. It backed the ball games. The brands were as much a part of television as the networks themselves. And the ads were good, slick, warm, aspirational, the kind of thing a kid would mimic in the backyard without the faintest idea what it was selling. Then came the day the broadcast ads went dark, pulled off the airwaves for good. The jingles stopped mid-stride. A child growing up after that would never sing a cigarette tune, never know the mascots your whole class knew by heart. And that, quietly, was exactly the point. Those jingles lived in your head for 50 years. The last generation to know them by heart is the one watching right now. Number 12. A smoking section inside the school. This one stops younger people cold when you tell them. There was a door at the high school, out by the gym, or off the side lot, and on the other side of it, students stood in the open air with cigarettes, and it was allowed. A designated spot, sometimes with a teacher's blessing, where kids old enough to drive were old enough, in the thinking of the day, to light up between classes. It sounds impossible now, but it fit the world it lived in. The teachers smoked in their lounge. The parents smoked at the kitchen table. Tobacco ran through every age of American life like a thread, and the schoolyard simply wasn't walled off from it. A teenager with a pack in his jacket was a teenager, not a scandal. The smoking sections closed the way everything on this list closed. Quietly, school board by school board, as the science hardened and the culture turned. One year there was a spot to smoke. A few years on, there wasn't, and there never would be again. The kids who used it grew up and could hardly believe it themselves. There was a door at your school the next generation will never find. You know exactly where it was. Number 11. Lighting up at 30,000 feet. You boarded the plane, found your seat, and there in the armrest was a little tray that flipped open. An ashtray, built right into the chair. The cabin filled slowly with smoke over the hours, the no smoking sign blinking on only for takeoff and landing. The non-smoking section was a few rows of the very same air. You could be a child in seat 14C, breathing it the whole way to grandma's. Air travel was glamorous then, and the cigarette was part of the glamour. The businessman with his drink and his smoke, the whole cabin wrapped in that blue haze somewhere over Kansas. Nobody questioned it. The ashtray in the armrest was as standard as the seatbelt, and a flight simply smelled the way it smelled. It took years to clear that air, flight by flight, route by route, until the smoking was gone from the sky entirely. Run your hand along an armrest on an old aircraft today, and you might still find the little tray, sealed shut now, a tiny relic of when the clouds outside weren't the only ones on the plane. The friendly skies used to come with an ashtray. You remember the haze. They'll only ever see the photographs. Number 10. Candy cigarettes in a little one's hand. There they were, right at the front of the candy counter at a child's eye level. A white stick of sugar with a red dipped tip, sold in a box made to look exactly like the real thing. A kid would tap one out, hold it between two fingers just like Dad, and puff until the chalky sweetness dissolved. Some even gave off a little cloud of powdered sugar when you blew through them. It was harmless fun. Everyone agreed. A nickel's worth of make-believe grown-up. Children played at being adults the way children always have, and in that era, being an adult plainly involved a cigarette. The candy just handed them the prop. No one running that store or buying that box meant a single thing by it. As the world changed its mind about the real thing, the pretend version got harder to defend, and those little boxes quietly slipped off the shelves. A child today would be puzzled by the whole idea. But you remember the taste, that dry, sweet, powdery snap, and the strange, small thrill of holding something you were pretending to be old enough for. It was sugar, shaped like the future we'd all picked up. We didn't see the joke in it yet. Number 9. A child sent to buy the cigarettes. Alone. Here's the one from the very start of our list. A mother could write a quick note, or not even bother, and hand her 10-year-old some coins with a simple instruction: run to the corner store and pick up my pack. And the boy would go, lay the money on the counter, say the brand, and the man would hand it right over. No ID, no raised eyebrow. A child buying cigarettes was just a child running an errand for the family. It worked because everyone trusted the chain of it. The kid wasn't smoking them, he was fetching them, the way he'd fetch a loaf of bread or a quart of milk. The shopkeeper knew the family. The whole transaction sat inside a web of small-town trust that didn't think to question itself. It was ordinary. It was even a little bit of a privilege, being old enough to be sent. That door closed hard as the laws on selling tobacco tightened, and rightly so, but it took with it that particular freedom, the trust that would send a child out into the world with a job to do and expect him to come right back. The corner store knew your name, it knew your mother's brand, and it would never think twice. You were old enough to be sent. That, more than anything, is what it felt like to be a kid back then. Pattern break 2. Stop the count with me again, because we've just walked through the smokiest stretch of this whole list, and there's a bigger story underneath it worth telling. If you came up in the 70s, tobacco wasn't a habit a few people had. It was the air. It was in the den, the diner, the dentist's waiting room, the cartoon between your shows, the candy in your hand, the errand you ran for your mother. An entire country lived inside that haze and never thought to wonder about it, because wondering required something we didn't fully have yet: the proof. And right around those years, the proof started coming in. The studies that had been whispering for a decade got louder and harder to wave off, and finally impossible to ignore. It wasn't one announcement. It was a slow tide, a report here, a warning label there, a lawsuit, a law, a generation of doctors who'd seen enough. The medical science of those years quietly turned a corner, and once it turned, there was no turning it back. That's the thing to understand about everything on this list. It didn't change because people got softer, or more fearful, or less free. It changed because we learned. Piece by piece, often the hard way, we came to know things our parents simply had no way of knowing, and knowing leaves you no choice. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, and you can't in good conscience hand the old world down to your children unchanged. So we don't get to keep both. That's the quiet ache underneath the nostalgia. We can be grateful for what we learned and still miss the ease of not knowing. Both of those things can be true in the same heart, at the same time. They are, for most of us watching right now. All right, we're down to the final 8, and these are the ones closest to the bone. Back to the count. Number 8. Toys with edges, points, and parts that could draw blood. Open the toy box of any kid you knew, and you'd find things that would never clear a safety review today. Metal cars with sharp pressed edges, building sets with points that could prick a finger, little soldiers and figures cast hard, some with bayonets you could actually feel, chemistry sets with real chemicals, toys that got hot, toys that fired things, toys with small parts a careless hand could swallow. They were wonderful. That's the part that's hard to explain now. The danger wasn't a flaw in them, it was woven right into the fun. A toy that could hurt you a little was a toy that trusted you to be careful, and a kid rose to that trust. You learned the edges by finding them. You got a scrape, and you kept playing. One by one, those toys got recalled, redesigned, rounded off, padded, and pulled from the shelves as the safety standards arrived and tightened. What replaced them was safer, and that's no small thing. But a certain thrill went out of the toy box. The quiet thrill of being handed something real, something with a bite to it, and being trusted not to get hurt. The toys used to trust you. Somewhere in all that plastic and padding, we stopped being trusted back. Number 7. The clackers that cracked like gunfire on the playground. You knew the sound before you knew the name. That hard, fast clack, clack, clack ringing across the schoolyard. 2 heavy acrylic balls on a string, and the game was to swing them so they smacked together, top and bottom, faster and faster, until the whole thing was a blur and a racket. Every kid wanted a pair. Every kid had the bruised wrists to show for it. They were a craze, pure and simple, the toy that swept through every school at once. And they had a habit the grown-ups didn't love. Swung hard enough, those balls could crack, could shatter, could send a sharp chip flying. Half the fun was how close to the edge they lived. You mastered them, or you wore the marks of trying. When the warnings came and the safety concerns mounted, the original clackers were pulled and remade into something tamer, something that wouldn't shatter. And the real ones, the dangerous ones, became a thing you only find now in a collector's drawer. The sound went quiet on the playgrounds. A whole generation can still make it with their mouth. You can still hear them, can't you? That clack, clack, clack was the sound of a recess that doesn't exist anymore. Number 6. Lawn darts arcing across the summer yard. A summer cookout, the grown-ups in their chairs, and out came the lawn darts, big weighted spikes with metal points, tossed underhand in a high arc to land, you hoped, inside a plastic ring on the grass across the yard. Kids and adults played together, the darts rising and falling against the blue sky, while someone flipped burgers and the radio played. It was a backyard staple, sold in a box at every department store, a game of summer afternoons. And those points were real metal, heavy enough to stick deep into the turf, which is exactly what made the toss so satisfying, and exactly what made them what they were. You watched the arc. You stayed clear of where it would land. Mostly. After enough hard lessons, the metal-tipped lawn dart was pulled from sale for good, one of the most famous bands of them all. And the version that came back, if it came back at all, had a soft, blunt tip that just wasn't the same. The arc went out of the summer yard. If you ever played it, you remember the particular hush of watching that spike come down. It was a game that asked you to pay attention. We don't make many of those for children anymore. Number 5. A baby in the front seat, in his mother's arms. Here's the picture that stops people cold. A mother rides in the front seat with her newborn held in her arms, or propped in a flimsy seat hooked over the back of the bench, or simply lying in a basket beside her. No 5-point harness, no rear-facing rules, no backseat law. The baby rode where the mother could reach him, and her arms were the whole safety system. It wasn't carelessness, it was love, doing the only thing it knew. A mother held her child close, because holding your child close is the oldest instinct there is. The hard plastic seats, the harness charts, the whole science of how a small body moves in a sudden stop, none of it had reached the family driveway yet. You held the baby. That was the plan. What changed this one was the crash data, plain and painful, and the car seat laws that followed it across every state. It saved an untold number of the very babies who'd once ridden in those arms. And still, there's something almost unbearably tender in the old way. The mother and child up front together, close enough to touch the whole drive home. She held you the entire way. She thought that was how you kept a baby safe. She was doing everything right with everything she had. Number 4. Riding along with no seatbelt, the whole family loose in the car. Here's the one I promised you at the very beginning. The family piles into the car for the long drive, and nobody buckles a thing. The belts are tucked down into the seat crack, ignored, maybe never once pulled across a lap. You stretch out in the back. The kids lie down in the rear window of the sedan, or stand up on the bench seat to see over Dad's shoulder, or pile 3 across with no thought of a click. The car is just a room you happen to be moving in. It's almost impossible to describe to a young person how free that felt. You could turn around, lie down, switch seats on the highway, ride in the open bed of a pickup with the wind in your hair and the road unspooling behind you. The belt existed. It was right there. But using it simply wasn't the habit, wasn't the law, wasn't the thing anyone did. The car held the family, and the family held itself. What changed this one was the seatbelt laws, state by state, and the crash science behind them. And it changed for the soundest reasons on this whole list. It saved more lives than we could ever count. But ask anyone who rode that way, and they'll get a far-off look, remembering the particular freedom of lying across the back seat, watching the telephone poles tick by, going somewhere, held by nothing but the trip itself. You rode the whole way loose and laughing. That feeling doesn't have a seatbelt. It never came back. Number 3. A wave goodbye at the airport gate. No checkpoint in sight. You could walk a loved one all the way to the airplane door. The whole family came. Right up to the gate. No ticket needed. No line, no checkpoint, no shoes in a bin. You stood at the big windows and watched the planes. You hugged Grandpa goodbye at the very threshold of the jetway, and you waved until the plane pushed back. Anyone could come to the gate. The airport was a place you visited just to watch the wonder of flight. It made flying feel like an occasion the whole family shared, not a gauntlet you ran alone. A child could press his nose to the glass while the jets roared. A wife could meet her husband the second he stepped off the plane. Right there, no barrier between them. The terminal was open, social, almost romantic. A public square with wings. That openness closed, hardened by a world that turned more dangerous and more careful all at once. and the modern checkpoint rose up between the curb and the gate for good. The reasons were real, and we all know them. But something warm went out of air travel. The whole family at the gate, waving a small figure up the steps and into the sky. You used to wave goodbye at the very door. Now you wave from the far side of a line you can't cross. Number 2. A kid on a bike with nothing on his head but the wind. A boy shoves off down the driveway, stands on the pedals, and tears down the street with not a stitch of protection. No helmet, no pads, hair blown straight back, going far too fast down the big hill and loving every second of it. Every kid rode this way. The bike was freedom itself, the first taste of going wherever your own legs could take you, and the head was bare because of course it was. Nobody owned a helmet. Nobody had heard of one. That bike meant everything. It was the whole neighborhood thrown open. The friend across town suddenly reachable, the afternoon stretched as far as you dared to pedal. You crashed sometimes. You scraped a knee, bent a rim, walked it home limping, and you were back on it the next day. The risk was just the cost of the freedom, and you paid it gladly, without ever counting it. The helmet laws and the safety push changed this one, and plenty of hard knocks made the case for them. Kids today are safer for it, truly. But there's a picture every one of us carries. A kid flying downhill, no helmet, no fear, the whole summer in front of him, that is simply gone from the streets now. The wind in your hair was the whole point. We traded it for something safer, and we were right to. We just don't get the wind back. And now, number 1, the one I've been saving since the very first minute. Number 1, kids playing on the railroad tracks. Picture it the way it really was. A handful of kids, a summer with nowhere it had to be, and the tracks running straight through the edge of town like a road built just for them. They'd walk the rails with arms out for balance, seeing who could go farthest without falling. They'd lay a penny down and wait for the train to flatten it into a smooth copper coin. They'd follow those tracks for miles, past the backs of the houses, past the grain elevator, out to where the town gave way to fields, just to see where they went. Nobody walked them out there. Nobody knew exactly where they were. The tracks were a meeting place, a highway, a dare, and a whole afternoon all at once. The freedom of that era distilled down to its purest, most dangerous, most beautiful form. You could hear a train coming a long way off, and getting clear in time was just part of the game. You weren't being reckless. You were being a kid, in a world that hadn't yet decided kids needed to be kept off the rails. What ended it was everything we've talked about tonight, all at once. The warnings, the fences, the laws, the slow, careful closing of a world that had always stood wide open. And the safety was real, and the reasons were good, and children are surely better protected now. But of everything we've lost, this is the image that holds it all. A kid balanced on a steel rail, arms out, the whole endless summer stretching down the line in front of him, no fear in him at all. That, more than anything, is the America we lost. Pattern break 3. So here we are at the end of the line, and I don't want to leave you with the wrong feeling. This was never a list about how foolish we were. It's a list about how free we were, and how little we knew it at the time. We breathed the air, rode the rails, leaned out the car window, and we were fine. Most of us, most of the time. And the world has gotten safer in 1,000 quiet ways since, and that is a good thing. It truly is. Not all of it was perfect. Some of those doors needed to close. But you're allowed to miss it anyway. You're allowed to remember the wind in your hair and the streetlights coming on and the long walk down the tracks, and feel that ache that doesn't have a name. That ache isn't foolish either. It's just love. For a time and a place, and the people who let you run free in it because they didn't yet know any other way. You remember it, and as long as you do, it isn't entirely gone. So let me ask you, before you go, which one of these did you do? Which one stopped you cold and took you right back? The bare feet on the bike pedals, the baby in your mother's arms, the penny on the rail waiting for the train, and what's the one we missed? The thing you did as a kid that you can't believe was ever allowed? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you grew up, and what Be Home by Dark meant on your street. I read them all, and so do the folks watching, because every story you leave is proof that somebody still remembers. This whole channel is a place for the ones who do. So tell me your memory. Let's keep it alive together, one comment at a time.